Hello, and thank you for coming along virtually to my talk. My name's Rebecca Duffus, and I'm an advisory teacher for autism. I started out working as a teaching assistant in a specialist school for autistic students after I'd done my psychology degree, and then went on to become a class teacher and then did a master's in autism and education, which has worked really well for my current role. So the plan for today, and this is kind of aimed at parents and staff within school, is to have a little think about the underlying potential differences that some of our students might be experiencing, and then think about a strategy toolbox. So some of the things we can do to support the students, and those are broken down into the areas below. Now I'm just going to quickly start off by mentioning terminology. So I will refer to the word autism a lot of the time. I don't use ASD. I find that the D, which stands for disorder, has very negative connotations. And so it's very hard, especially as a parent and a young person, to be told you have a disorder and then be expected to be positive about it. So using that language, kind of society often sets the child up to fail. So I try and focus on much more positive language, thinking about differences rather than a disorder. And I will use the other terms sort of interchangeably in terms of person with autism and autistic person. Research found that the majority of adults who are autistic preferred to be called an autistic person. But it's so person dependent that obviously if you're working with a child or your own child, it's important to find out what language they like. And I've just included these pictures at the bottom because it's a useful reminder that there's often different ways of doing things. There isn't just one correct way. We're all different. Children often know these symbols from quite an early age, and they will know that if, for example, you have an Android phone or an Apple phone, they might have a slightly different charger. There might be a slightly different order that you would do something to get the same end result. And that's a bit like people who are autistic and people who aren't autistic. You might do things in a slightly different way, but that doesn't mean that one is better or worse than the other. So just to think about the underlying differences. Now, the diagnostic criteria that is used when you get a diagnosis of autism in England is the ICD-11, and in America it's DSM-5. That's just the name of the manual. But basically it breaks down the criteria to be these areas on the star. So the blue areas are all kind of related to social aspects, communication, interaction, and then things around behaviour and interests, which we'll go into. But as well as that, there's often sensory, well, probably always sensory implications or differences, and as a result of all of that, there's often anxiety that goes alongside that. So thinking about social interaction. Now, some people will say that their child or somebody in their class is quite good at making friends, but finds it tricky to maintain the friendships. So sometimes this is around unpicking all of those social rules that really there isn't a rule for. There's no rule book, sadly. And sometimes a young person might come across as socially inappropriate. I've put that in quote marks because who decides what is appropriate? But it might be that, you know, in terms of communication, I've worked with students where they've decided somebody's given them their number, so then that means in their mind that that's their friend, a very good friend perhaps, but the other person might not see it in the same way. They may then send multiple messages, perhaps this child was sending sort of 15 to 20 without getting any reply. And then the other person involved might see that as a bit over the top and a bit kind of intense. But for some autistic students, they may not know, you know, how many is too many. Similarly, the types of language you're using. So again, with the older student, we were trying to work out what was a compliment and what was kind of creepy. And there's quite a fine line, and it's very hard to actually unpick, you know, what is the rule there, because there is no set rule. So, and often it's just about reading the other person and noticing, oh, you know, do I think they're going to like that? You just make a judgment in the moment. based on their reaction and your kind of history of the relationship you've had with them. So when you start thinking about social interactions, they're really complicated. And this can be a really kind of tricky area for autistic individuals. They tie in a lot with emotions, understanding your own emotions as well as the emotions of others, which also ties into the sensory differences, because you have to be able to work out if you, for example, if you've got a churning feeling in your stomach, is that because I'm ill? Is it because I'm feeling anxious? Is it because I haven't eaten anything? I'm hungry. And depending on whether that's an emotional feeling or more of a sensory feeling would affect how you respond to that. So it can get quite complicated. Some of the positive things, though, are that actually seeing things differently can be a really good thing. A lot of the inventors who have had a big impact on society were people who didn't conform and try and do things in the socially appropriate way. And they then made, dramatic inventions or, had a big impact on others because they had that courage to be different and determination. And may like time alone. So autistic individuals sometimes will say to me they don't get enough time alone, particularly in school environments when it can be quite overwhelming with big groups of people, and you go from one lesson to the next to break time, and you don't really get a moment's peace. But just because that young person is out in the playground on their own and has chosen to be on their own, sometimes people say, oh yeah, they're quite happy to be on their own. I don't think they really want friends. That's not necessarily the case. You can like to have time on your own, but also be lonely. So sometimes there might need to be some support around how to develop those friendships. Now, social communication, this is around understanding the kind of intentions of other people based on their communication. And obviously, communication is not just verbal. There's the majority of our language actually is body language, facial expressions, your eyes, your mouth, hand gestures, etc. And sometimes we'll have students where the teacher will say, right, everybody, it's time for assembly, line up at the door. And then she'll wait and, half the class haven't done that. So then she changes her communication. Hand goes on the hip, the voice goes a bit more strict. She gets her frowning face on and she says, do you want to go to assembly? In her kind of scariest voice. And a lot of the children will think, uh-oh, she's got the hands on the hip. She's starting to mean business now. We better get on and do what she's wanting us to do. But if you're not picking up on all of those cues, you're just going to hear a question. Do you want to go to assembly? No, thank you very much. I'd rather stay here. And that sometimes is what our students will say. And then they'll get into trouble for being rude, when actually they were just being asked a question and they replied. So sometimes having a literal understanding of language, not understanding the implied meaning. Understanding sarcasm and then distinguishing, is something a joke? Was it banter? Is it funny? Is it rude? Am I being bullied? It's very hard to tell a lot of the time. And thinking about expressive and receptive language discrepancies. So actually, a lot of children will be able to understand language, so that's the receptive language, before they start communicating themselves, which is expressive. But often with autistic young people, they will start talking maybe in long sentences about air conditioning units or complicated things that they understand, but their receptive language may not be at the same level as what they can talk about. And that can be confusing because educators often make a judgment that if you're able to talk that much about something, then surely you can understand when I ask you to go and get your coat on and line up at the door. But it may not be on the same kind of level, or you may need a slightly different way of communicating and presenting that information. So restrictive and repetitive behaviour interests relate to kind of two separate things. There's the area around wanting things to be a certain way and wanting to have control, often because social situations, as we've just seen, are so out of our control a lot of the time and often quite unpredictable. So actually, if I can retreat into something that really interests me, and a lot of autistic individuals have a far higher level of being able to pay attention, so can actually spend hours on a task that interests them far longer than somebody who's not autistic. But this can be difficult in school if the task that you want to spend time on is not the same as the one the teacher wants you to spend time on. There can be this very strong attention to detail. So sometimes that's seen as focusing on the small detail and sort of missing the bigger picture. And that can be quite a cause of anxiety, because if you, for example, on the route to school, if rather than seeing the bigger picture of I'm going to school, just like I did yesterday and the day before and last week, and instead you're picking up on all the tiny little details. So, oh, mum's got her hair tied up today, but yesterday she had it down. And she's got a slightly different perfume on. And hang on, that car wasn't parked outside yesterday. It was a blue car. And the leaves, 5 extra leaves have fallen off the tree this morning. And it's sunny, but yesterday it was cloudy. All those tiny little things that actually may have a really good memory for, but they then affect the overall picture of the aim is to get to school, and those things don't necessarily matter in that bigger picture. That can therefore cause anxiety. But at the same time, if you have a very good attention to detail and you are spotting patterns, or you are doing coding, or something that really requires that skill, it can be a real strength. Perfectionism is something that I think related to that. A lot of students I work with will say it's not good enough unless I get 100% or 10 out of 10. And 9 out of 10 is just not really worth mentioning, even though I will say, well, wow, that's amazing. They often can't see that. And I think sometimes that relates to that wanting to be in control of everything, and also just wanting to get everything right, really. Stimming is around sometimes a sensory need to do repetitive behaviours, so perhaps flapping your hands, eye motions, repetitive things that serve a purpose. So they may be calming, they may be giving additional sensory input, but they could also be a repetitive behaviour. And it can be difficult to shift attention and also generalise. So if you learn a skill in one setting, like toilet training, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to generalize those skills to another toilet that's got a different color toilet seat and a different color door and smell and everything. You might have to relearn those set of skills in the second environment. And obviously with shifting attention, that can be tricky in lessons, because you often have to go from looking down at your book to up at the board to looking at something else and back again, and actually shifting attention like that, but also shifting attention from maths is finished, now we're going on to English. That can be a source of stress sometimes, and link back to the perfectionism that actually I want to finish all of my maths questions. I'm not ready to go on to my English yet. I need everything to be just right and sorted there, and then I can kind of close that chapter of my mind and move on to the next thing. So as we've mentioned, sensory differences play a big part, but I could talk about this for another 2 hours alone. So we just have to touch on them very quickly. We probably are all aware of the senses at the top, but there's also these additional senses at the bottom, which are around your body awareness senses. And basically with all our senses, you can be over or undersensitive at any time, and that can differ from different days, but also throughout the day. So that's why you've got this ziggy-zaggy line, because actually all of our sensory profiles are quite up and down. And you'll know that from conversations you've had with people generally. For example, bedding is often one where people have different preferences. You might like to sleep with thick pajamas on and be really snuggly and have a big blanket on top of you, or some people prefer to have less and just a small sheet on them, or prefer to not have any bedding at all. And that's often linked with sensory differences, temperature, the amount of kind of weight you like on yourself, all of that kind of thing. So we all have our own sensory preferences and differences. But with autism, individuals often have a kind of different sensory profile, which may mean that they're particularly over or undersensitive in some of these areas. So I've worked with children where they've got a really strong sense of taste, and they can tell when their mum tries to sneak in spinach into a sauce, or if the margarita pizza that's been bought is Asda brand or Tesco brand, just from the taste of it. There was a student who could smell cans of baked beans and tell what shop they'd been bought from, even though they were all Heinz baked beans branded. So that can be quite a ability, really, but it can interfere with daily life, because actually if that smell is overpowering you, maybe they're cooking dinner in the kitchens down the hall, how are you supposed to concentrate on writing a story when that's all that's filling your mind? And often the different senses will come in, the information from the senses will come in with equal importance. So you could again be sitting in the classroom and an aeroplane goes overhead, the computer's buzzing, the lights making a flickering sound or visual impact, somebody's tapping their foot or pencil, someone smells a bit funny, and all of that information is coming in as well as the teacher's voice, but actually they're all coming in with equal importance. And whereas some of us can filter out the stuff that's less important to focus on the one thing we want to, often our students can't do that, and so actually the aeroplane is just as loud as the teacher, and that can be really difficult in the classroom setting. So just a reminder that the Disability Equality Act says that schools have to make reasonable adjustments, and that actually this might involve treating students more favourably than others. So sometimes you might say, oh, can this child sit on a chair instead of on the carpet? And sometimes teachers will worry, well, the other children will ask, why does he get to sit on the chair and they don't? And maybe it's not fair. But actually, the Equality Act states that you should be making these adjustments, and that doesn't matter if you feel that that person's getting treated more favourably, because actually they need that. And whereas if it was a physical difference, and you needed a ramp or something, you wouldn't say, well, that's not fair. You'd give that child what they needed. So we need to just think about what our children might need. So going into the strategies. So we're going to start with maximising communication. So thinking about what you're saying. Now, as I mentioned, students can sometimes say more than they understand. And this is particularly with verbal language. So where possible, especially if you're giving instructions, try to reduce your verbal input. Try not to say too many words. So if you can say, instead of saying, oh, Johnny, we're going to have a lovely bath before bedtime. So I've put some lovely bubbles in there and we're going to get you all nice and cozy and warm before bed. You might just say, Johnny, bath time. Now that's far easier to process. It can seem a bit harsh sometimes to parents and school staff, because sometimes we use that nurturing language as a kind, like we say, as to nurture the child or feel like we're giving them a kind of an emotional positive message. But actually, if you find it really hard to process lots of words, just say the important words. So children have said to me, when they get told a sentence, they will then convert it into a visual in their head. So they'll write it all out, maybe in handwriting, in their minds, maybe typing it, checking it's grammatically correct and full stops and punctuation, obviously. And then by the time they've done all that, you've said 10 other things. So actually trying to be clearer and say less is really important. And research has shown that autistic individuals may need 10 to 20 seconds to process verbal language. Now this is particularly focused on verbal, because there's lots of other ways to communicate that are much easier for autistic individuals to process. And this is not for all. All of these strategies are general recommendations, and you will know your child or your students far better than anybody else. So you will know, and you can try and see what they like and what works. It's important to also be specific. So try and say what you actually mean. So like we said earlier, sometimes we say things in a funny way. We ask a question when it's not really a question. And we use idioms and metaphors and things in our language. So you might want to avoid those some of the time and try and speak as clearly as possible, but they will still crop up, and they do with me a lot of the time when I'm working with students. So use that as an opportunity to explain what you have meant. You know, I've said this, but actually it means this. There's some nice books you can get explaining idioms as well. Sometimes using the person's name before you start can be useful, because if, as we've said about, they're queuing into the aeroplane going overhead, the buzzing, actually hearing their name might help them to focus on what you're saying over all of this other sensory input that's going on. And try and check for understanding, so get them to explain back to you what you've asked. Get them to go through maybe a checklist. We'll talk about visuals in a minute. But also remember that listening may look different. So I've observed children where they've been under the table or in a tent at the back of the classroom, and they don't appear to me to really be listening. You know, they're not sitting up smartly with, you know, looking at the teacher. But then the teacher will ask a question and you'll hear this voice calling out completely the correct answer. And actually sometimes we all listen in different ways. So we might need to have our hands busy, might need to be doodling, might be, you know, fidgeting a bit more. And we need to account for that actually, you may have noticed from working from home and things like that, that actually we don't all work and listen and kind of behave in the same way. Different things work for different people. Okay, start standing up with your feet together and your arms by your side. Inhale and raise your arms perpendicular to the floor. Either keep the arms parallel, palms facing inward, or join the palms. Exhale and bend your knees, trying to take the thighs as nearly parallel to the floor as possible. The knees will project out over the feet and the torso will lean slightly forward over the thighs until the front torso forms approximately a right angle with the tops of the thighs. Keep the inner thighs parallel to each other and press the heads of the thigh bone down towards the heels. Firm your shoulder blades against the back. Take your tailbone down towards the floor and in towards the pubis to keep your lower back long. Now, I expect that you've all done wonderfully and you look just like this. No? How much easier is it if I just show you that rather than all of that language? Obviously, language can be useful for detail and instructions, but having that visual, if I'd said the stuff at the same time, you would have known exactly what I was talking about. So it's just a quick reminder of the importance of visuals. And Temple Grandin, an autistic adult, says she thinks in pictures. Words are like a second language to me. When somebody speaks, the words are instantly translated into pictures. And a lot of students have said that to me as well. Might be worth asking some of your children or the young people you work with, because recently I've had a few parents who have said to me they've been amazed at what their child has discovered in sessions, because we've been looking at, you know, what autism actually feels like for the young person. And obviously you only know what is normal for you. You don't know if everybody else or a lot of people experience something differently. So having these conversations can be really useful to help the young person become more aware of themselves. So why are visuals vital? So they can help a person to hold on to that thought, because once words have gone, they've just disappeared. But if you've got something visual in front of you, something to refer back to. Can also then help to reduce anxiety and help to understand what is actually being asked of them, what's expected. Can then help to understand what's going to happen next, so routines and sequencing. And it also gives the adult a point of reference, meaning that if you are working with the same child each day, or different people are working with a child, you can all be singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak. So it can also sometimes avoid challenge, because actually if you've got a visual stuck up on the wall with a set of rules, you can say, well, this is just the school rules. It's not me imposing them on you. It's just something that we all have to abide to. So sometimes that can help to make them a bit less direct, a bit more kind of impartial. And it can help the young person to become more independent, because they're not always relying on the adult to prompt them verbally the whole time for the next step. They're able to go through them steps themselves. Now, how easy has it been for us to respond to visuals? If we had gone into shops and restaurants when we were allowed to, and there'd been an audio recording in your ear saying, hello, please make sure you do this and don't do that, and blah, 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 compared to this, very clear pictures on the floor. We all know exactly what they mean straight away, and we've all been quite good, I think, at picking up on them and following them. So this is just a good demonstration of how much easier it is to follow visuals. So thinking about how we can use these in the classroom. So it could be about a timetable, a structure for something, and we'll go into examples of that. But also gestures are visuals as well. So if there's an action that you do, could be like Makaton or a certain type of sign language, but they could all just be a symbol that you use with a young person. Sometimes teachers will have an agreed sort of secret code symbol that they will use as a reminder to that young person. Instead of having to announce in front of everybody a reminder, can you do this? There could just be a secret symbol that they have. It can be useful to give information about social situations, having a social script or examples of what different people do. And as you can see on the pictures here, I will often just use post-it notes. Now it depends on your child and where they're at in terms of understanding different pictures. The best thing to use with visuals is, first of all, especially if they're younger, is the actual object. So these are called objects of reference. So for example, if it was about toilet training, you would show the child the potty and then take them to go and sit on it. Then you might show them a photograph of their actual potty so they can relate. That's exactly the same thing. Then you might later on show them a picture of a different potty. Because remember I said that generalizing, it can be difficult to realize, oh, that's still a potty, even though it's a different color from my potty. And then it could be a cartoon picture or a drawing of a potty. So you can see the kind of stages of being able to understand that drawing still relates to that object. There's sort of developmental stages. So see what works for your child. If they are able to understand drawn pictures or even read words, that's really useful to just carry around a pack of post-it notes or a mini whiteboard you could use at home and in school to quickly write out the plan for that session or the lesson, or the things they need to remember. Or if something happened at break time, let's draw out the people that are involved. Let's do some speech bubbles and some thought bubbles so that we can see maybe what the other person might have been thinking and explore all of those sort of social interactions. And it can also be useful just to explain sort of rules and responsibilities. So here's some examples. You could use things like a first this, then, first next board. So at the top here, you've got first reading, then puzzle. And then with another child who might be able to read, you could have the different sections of the lesson. So it could be first, it's carpet session, need to listen to the teacher. Next, read the text, underline the adjectives, then answer your questions, check your work, and you've got a follow on what to do when you've finished. And you could have that template laminated and it gets used in each lesson. You explain to the whole class what they're all doing, and then you just check in with that student. Right, what are we doing first? You get them to tell you, you can write it down, what's happening after that, and then what are we doing last of all. And using that structure, a lot of students still use the words, even if they're not necessarily being shown the visual anymore. So sometimes secondary students will use that still first, next, then, because it's very clear to know what's expected of you. Timers can be another really useful visual. sand timers, or you can get these light up ones that change colors based on how much time is left, as well as electronic timers that you can have up on the whiteboard or just like a kitchen timer or your phone. They can be useful to help understand how long a piece of time is, because often it's very hard for children to understand concepts of time, and also to prepare for something maybe that's going to end. So you've got 10 more minutes on the PlayStation or the iPad or whatever, or 10 minutes until dinner time. So just to give that, so it's not so sudden when it happens and you're saying, well, it's time to turn it off, and they're not ready to finish because they haven't had that preparation time. It can also be useful to break down different routines in the day. So Twinkle at the bottom there is a really useful website which has a lot of free downloadables and lots of visuals on there. So for example, for the morning routine, bedtime routine, toileting, and they have them for boys and girls. Could be just for part of the day, so maybe after school routine here you've got that checklist going down, or it could be for lessons in the day that you might want to colour code, particularly if they're at secondary school, colour code different subjects. So perhaps English is always in pink on their timetable, and then they have a pink folder, and everything they need for English goes in that pink folder. So the night before they can check, oh, I've got a pink lesson, a blue lesson, and a green lesson, and they get those things out, put them in their bag, ready to go. It could also be for a sequencing a process, so like making a sandwich. You could have some pictures there so that the young person can break down the steps involved in that task. That's something that often students of whatever age will find it difficult to know, and sometimes because of that fear of getting it wrong and wanting to be a perfectionist, they won't necessarily just try it out. Could be a kind of barrier to having a go. And this is important to remember, that this is not related to academic ability. So there's a guy called Jamie and Lyon who works for the BBC, and I think he does quite a lot of like coding and quite important jobs. And he gives talks, and he's often said he's had to prioritize what's important to him. So it was very important to him that he had his own job and he worked and earned a living and enjoyed that, and it gave him value. But it meant that he said other parts of the day, like cooking his dinner, he couldn't do that and have a job. It was just too much. It would overload him mentally. So he has a carer who comes in, who sorts out his dinner, because he said even with like a ready meal, it's not just as simple as put it in the microwave. He was saying, well, what if something's in front of the door of the microwave? How many holes do I prick on the top? All that kind of, again, focusing on the finer detail rather than seeing the bigger picture of just heat it up. It doesn't really matter about that stuff. But obviously it does if that's something that you're worried about. Just an example here of some visuals on post-it notes. So this could be about going to a party, if we ever get to go to parties again. There'll be food and drink. It's got an example of something you could say, hello. There'll be lots of people, but we get to come back home again, and then there's our house on the end. So that's a nice reminder that actually we're not going to be stuck at Auntie Sue's house forever, because like I said, with concepts of time, children aren't always aware that there is a next on their timetable. So there's some examples of, as I mentioned, just having a post-it note to describe if you have a lesson, what's we going to do in that lesson. Yeah, it's English, I've seen that on the timetable, but what does that actually mean? What are the steps I'm going to take in my English lesson, and how will I know if I'm halfway through or if it's finished? And I will use these sort of schedules when I'm doing one-to-one sessions with students, and it helps me as well because I can keep on track and think, oh yeah, we're okay for time, we're down to here. People sometimes worry, oh, but if it's written down, what if I can't stick to it? And it's true that you do have to be up for sticking to a schedule. If you're saying you're going to do something, then generally you have to try and do it. But I will often use other symbols. So I might have an arrow to say, right, we're running out of time for this one, so we're going to do an arrow, and we'll follow that up next time. And I'll try and use the same symbols, so then I'll always use an arrow for when we're going to do that again. Or I might add in an extra bit. And I think if you just do it gradually so that the child trusts the system and realizes that you're following through on what you're saying as much as possible, then it will still really help to reduce anxiety and add predictability. Here's an example of when you could use it for unstructured times, like break times, having a visual example of things that the child could do each day, just simple things that they don't need lots of extra adults for. You can use it for calendars, so to show when somebody's coming into school perhaps, or when someone's coming to visit. The days in school and the days at home, particularly useful when it's school holidays or lockdown. And Christmas is a really useful one for this, because you can put on there, this is the day the Christmas tree is going up. This is the day we're going to be singing carols at school or making Christmas cards or watching a film, because particularly in primary schools, the timetable that was very predictable suddenly becomes quite unpredictable at Christmas time. And when is the Christmas tree going back down again? Because that's just as unpredictable. It suddenly all disappears again like it never happened. So that can be really useful, and children often find they like to tick it off before bed each night, particularly if they're counting down to an event. It helps them to get used to the days of the week and the passing of time again. Choice boards can be another useful visual just to show children what's on offer. Sometimes children will always go to the same toy, particularly in like reception settings, but this can help to show, you can choose from these things. Sometimes parents will say, I'll take him to the sweet shop and say you can choose whatever chocolate bar you want, and then he gets really upset, or she gets really upset. And that's generally because it's just too much choice. So sometimes you need to limit the choice and just say, would you like a twirl or a crunchie? And just have that kind of make it a bit easier for them. A whoops card can be a really useful visual to use when something changes. So if something was on the timetable, or somebody was going to come and visit, or you were going to go for dinner at the weekend, but then Boris changed the rules, you might want to use something like a whoops card to say, oh, whoops, something's happened differently. This is what we're going to do instead. Using the same symbol or the same language can help to make it feel more predictable, because anxiety generally comes from a lack of feeling in control and not being certain about what's going to happen. But if you're using the same language, you've got a symbol for it, it feels a bit more like it's planned and that it's not as scary. Plan B, prompt card. So again, this is really useful for secondary students, what they can do in different scenarios. You will have probably talked through all of this, what to do if the bus doesn't come, if you forget your homework. But when you're in that moment of anxiety, it's very hard to think logically and remember, what was it she said to me? So if you can have a small little card, if there's a particular scenario, that could go in their pocket, and it then gives that prompt of what they can do in that situation. Particular outings or trips, breaking down the steps again within the day or the trip can be helpful. And I've just left there, I won't go through them all again, but there's just a list there of some of the examples of uses for visuals, because I know I've gone through loads of them and it can be a bit overwhelming, but you might want to take a photo of this or a screenshot or something, because you might think, oh yeah, I'll try one of them for now and then come back and try another one at another time. Don't overwhelm yourself, because then you just won't do any of it. It has to be manageable for you as well. So the environment. So thinking about school environment, we want to think about what support there is for the child. So is there a place that the child could go to, a place of peace? And I'll show you some pictures of that. What is there in the environment? And how are we supporting this dual empathy? So yes, we need to support the autistic students, but actually it shouldn't be all the focus on them. There also needs to be education of neurotypicals or non-autistic individuals, or those who don't have additional like dyslexia, neurodiversities. There needs to be a focus to help them understand the autistic individual, because actually it works both ways. We need to both be helping each other. So you might want to use some things in the classroom, or particularly if it's a reception class, it can be useful to have a different coloured tablecloth for certain activities, because then that's a visual cue. signs up. You might want to use some of these things to support with sensory differences. So you've got a picture there of a wobble board to put your feet on, elastic bands round the chair legs that if the child likes to swing a lot, sometimes that gives the similar feedback on their feet. Things like sitting on a wobble cushion. There's lots of things you can try. There's a useful book by Lauren Bruckner called How to Stay Awesome and in Control, and that gives lots of different sensory tools that you can teach the young person. And a lot of it's things you don't need equipment for, so it's something they can just do in their chair, like squeezing their hands together when they're feeling a certain way, and that can help to sort of regulate their system. Thinking about what's autism friendly for your students. So I've included here some different pictures. I was very guilty of the top right picture. That's not actually my classroom, but when I was a class teacher, we were doing the rainforests as a topic. And I thought, oh, lovely, like I can hang loads of stuff on the ceiling and have all these leaves and monkeys and all sorts of things hanging down. And a lot of the children loved it. But looking back, I can see now that for some students, that was just way too overwhelming in terms of sensory colours and visual stimulus. So then you've got pictures of some autistic specialist schools or bases where they keep it much more minimalistic. So it's thinking, what does your student need and your class as a whole? Because obviously you can't strip the whole class back if some children really like that, but you can provide an area where it's a lot less visually overwhelming, and that can be helpful for some of those students. And same here, thinking about the different sensory impacts. So the one top left I thought was interesting because obviously it's minimalistic, but all I can focus on is the shiny floor, and it's really reflective. Same as the bottom right where it's got those strip lights, which I can't stand. Different students will have different preferences. And this is nice, quite a forward-thinking classroom where the children have the option of sitting at a desk, sitting on one of those rocking kind of seats, or sitting on a wobble cushion. I think that might have been in America, but there are options like that. Sometimes sitting on a gym ball instead of a chair can be much better for a student to concentrate, or sitting on a chair instead of the carpet. And this is an example of a place of peace. So it could be like a book corner in the classroom, or one school just created this in the corridor. They had a table and they velcroed some black tablecloth or sheet around the edges, and they put some kind of sensory calming tools inside. And children knew that was a place they could retreat to if they just needed some chill out time. So it wasn't associated with a behaviour plan, it wasn't a consequence. It was just to be able to regulate when everything's getting a bit much. I just need to kind of go somewhere and chill. And sensory circuits can be a useful way of getting additional sensory input. So you could set up symbols like this on the floor and have systems where the children know for the blobs they have to jump or have to twist. Then the next one they have to reach up to the sky and down to their toes. Different things that might give them additional sensory feedback. And it's really important to think about special interest. And the word special interest is interesting in itself. I remember hearing an autistic person speaking as an adult and saying, why is, if you're not autistic, it's just a hobby, and why for me is it a special interest? What's that all about? It's obviously it's something where the child is highly motivated to focus on, and a student said to me that actually, the whole special interest thing is obviously because for this child anyway, he had the ability to spend way too much time on it and then become immersed in it, so that it went from being a positive thing to being completely overwhelming and not always giving him enjoyment anymore. So it is useful to sometimes think about sort of some boundaries around the interest. For example, if the interest is going on Twitter and talking to other autistic people, great, but make sure you educate them about how to use Twitter, people online safety. Are people always who they say they are online? What information you should give out, and how many hours a day you should be spending. Because actually, if you're spending all your waking free hours on Twitter, that's not necessarily a good use of time. But if it's giving you enjoyment for a couple of hours or an hour, that's fine. And where possible, include this in the curriculum. So if you are writing about fairy tales and you want the children to write, describing sentences, descriptive words, adjectives, and things like that, about fairy tales, because that's your topic, does it have to be about fairy tales? If the objective is for them to write a descriptive sentence and they love donkeys or they love trains, can they write a sentence about that instead? Because I guarantee that's going to be far easier for you and them, and you're probably getting the same outcome. But as teachers, sometimes we can be a bit inflexible. And autistic individuals have said this quite a few times actually. Who's the one being, inflexible and having the, rigidity of thought here? It's supposed to be, apparently stereotypically it's supposed to be autistic individuals, but actually we can all be a bit stuck in our ways sometimes, and it's really useful to think outside the box of how could you do things differently. Because if that's going to motivate the person and enjoy it, and they can still get the same outcome, you don't have to write about fairy tales. You can deviate from that. And just considering sensory differences. So try and do a learning walk of your classroom or your school, and have a think, how might it be to that child? Like I said, is the dangly things from the ceiling too much? Or actually, they may love that, and that may be something that you want to include more of so that they get the positive experiences of the sensory system. And thinking about social and emotional well-being. 84% of autistic individuals or children have additional mental health difficulties compared to only 15% in the general population. So schools really need to think about how to support that. And something like the zones of regulation can be a really useful strategy, because you can use it to communicate how you're feeling, and it links again to the sensory feelings. So if you're feeling a bit blue and a bit lethargic and tired, what can I do to bring me back into the green zone? And that's something that schools can easily use as a whole class approach. It doesn't need to be just for that student. And last of all, pupil voice is so important. So you want to include the pupil in whatever is going on, getting their input, getting their opinions, and often they can tell you far more than what you're guessing about them. They're the expert in their own experience. So thank you very much for joining me. I hope you found that useful, whether you're working within a school or as a professional or parent. You can find more information via the Cognos website, and you can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where we provide lots of different links to useful resources, events, and information. Thank you.